Mark Adams. I just moderated a panel on merging the methodologies of science and artistic creation, and we had a really lively dialogue back and forth with the audience and with each other that actually left some questions open, which is very satisfying.
I think it went well.
Yeah. So,
I think we explored some interesting questions around process and communities and advocacy that I think will hopefully inform the rest of the discussions going forward this weekend.
And I think also the idea of process over product, of discussion being the value rather than perhaps results, is I think what's most fruitful for me about this engagement question.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I'm Joerg, Dressler, visual artist, and as a visual person, I always feel like there's this collective brain that is floating in the room that we're all feeding into with our comments and our thoughts, and then ultimately it's the challenge of turning that collective brain into something that can be then communicated to more than just our group, our community.
So hopefully that's what this does for everyone.
Yeah, really engaged audience. It was good. A lot of good questions. Yeah. A lot of back and forth. Great.
And yeah, really cool mix of talents and disciplines here, from coastal geology, visual art, poetry, and naturalists. And let's see, it's hard to put you in.
I know.
Scientists.
Former scientist, interdisciplinary.
Let's just call
we'll go with that.
Let's just call you a blacksmith marathoner.
That's nothing I do.
Yeah, that was cool.
Back after your break. I guess I'll kick this off. I'm Mark Adams. Let's see, I work for the National Park Service as a cartographer, geologist, and I'm also a painter, visual artist in town. So, like several people on our panel, I kind of have a foot in both worlds, like Liz, there's an idea that we can do some self-collaboration if we can speak across the divide. But this panel is essentially about methods. And when it comes to science, there's a statistical method. There's all kinds of science, of course, and all kinds of ways to form hypotheses, but everything is tested by a kind of some very long-standing conventions about statistical validity. And you might say that artists come to the same place by a very different means. And you have sort of conventions of aesthetics that might go to Aristotle's golden mean. But most artists don't study Aristotle. They use their intuition to get to those elements, like in the Japanese garden, where you have three things that are kind of composed in a way that has resonance. And these are basically parts of human psychology. So we're trying, with this discussion and with an experiment that's taking place with a couple of our panelists, to bring together these ways of thinking. And just to, we think about like what is collaboration, and how does inspiration occur. There's things that collaboration is not, to me, and sometimes there's a really famous incident of a Beirut musician going out to play his jazz saxophone as the bombs were falling across the valley, as an act of interactive opposition to the collaborator, which was the bombers. Very powerful, but not the same kind of collaboration that we're talking about. There's also the idea that even within science or even within the arts, collaboration is not second nature. Sometimes scientists have a hard time talking to other scientists because they have different languages and they have different ways of looking at the world. But especially physical science geologists are sometimes find it very fruitful to understand human history and put archaeology and the history of human culture in the context of what the rocks are saying, what the layers of rocks are saying. Anyway, there's this beautiful book called A Beautiful Question by Frank Wilczek, who's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at MIT. And this was given to me by Graham Geis, a geologist, that Mark works with. And one of the things that is that basically the concept here is that when you that facts often arrange themselves in beautiful ways, and that even the task of the scientist is to create an aesthetic around information. And one very short incident here, he talks about Einstein and Bohr were basically, they put together these outrageous hypotheses about packets of light and the structure of the atom, but they're not proposing theories of everything, or even a grand synthesis like the life work of Newton or someone. Rather, in an exploratory way, they're simply identifying patterns of facts that might find a deeper explanation in the long run. A successful theory of something can be more valuable than an attempted theory of everything. So I think that's a nice byword. I was going to try and introduce each panelist, but I think I might like to just give you each a minute to introduce yourselves, and that way we'll just kind of lubricate the conversation. So why don't we start with Stephanie, and you can tell us where you're from.
So I'm Stephanie Vasko. I am the Managing Director for the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinary. I'm also a research member of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which has its home in the Center for Interdisciplinary. The center is new. It started last summer-ish. I came on in the fall. And the goal really is to bring the arts and humanities to the forefront of interdisciplinary collaborations. So we're really trying to work on campus to build opportunities for those things to exist. As a member of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, so that's how I came to Michigan State. I was a postdoc, I was the program manager, and now I'm a member of the research community. What the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative does is work with interdisciplinary teams, some of which are art science collaborations. So we have a long-standing collaboration with the Living Architecture Systems Group up in Toronto through a Canadian Shirk grant. That's one of the projects we're working on. But we use philosophical interventions to help groups unpack their ideas and assumptions. So we build dialogue-based workshops that feature prompts that ask people to think about what their positionality is on something. And then we have groups engage in unstructured dialogue, and we allow them to kind of unpack what their views, values, and assumptions to make what might be implicit explicit through dialogue, and now also through co-creation activities. So I should mention a bit about my background. I didn't train as a philosopher. I have a PhD in chemistry and nanotech. I went into the Rock Ethics Institute for my first postdoc, where I met Michael Joerg, who's the director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, when I was talking with him about a project that he was doing with my advisor at the time on climate change and like regional approaches to climate change. So that's kind of like the day job, right? Worked in philosophy departments, worked on ethics. Also a blacksmith who finds inspiration through where land and water come together. So I grew up near the Appalachian Trail, where the glacial lakes are in northwest New Jersey. And now I live in Michigan, where most of my summer is spent near the Great Lakes. And so those things really influence kind of forms that I look at for that. And I also am pretty involved in the local Lansing community, which is the town next to where Michigan State is. And I do things like teach wearable electronics workshops at the makerspaces and at our fashion incubator. So I try and wear all of those hats when I work with teams to think about the different processes I've engaged in, the different types of methods and process that I've seen or worked with when we develop things like these prompts. So for some of the conversation today, I want to see things like, is your collaboration, well, let's make it a really just like effective dialogue starting statement. Your collaboration isn't finished until you've communicated with the public, would be one. The arts have just as much to contribute to climate change strategies as scientific research, would be another. So those are things I kind of want to put out to the other panelists, because I'm curious about what you all think about these things.
Great, thanks. So we'll come back to more of those prompts as we go. And I want to encourage a kind of a discussion and not just a presentation. And also from the audience too, if you want to raise your hand anytime. Are you raising your hand?
No, I've got mine.
Yeah, you got a
I've got the
microphone.
mic.
But let's make this freewheeling. And so again, sorry for the interruption, but Liz, go ahead.
I'm Elizabeth Bradfield. I live here in North Truro, just down the road. I am a writer and a naturalist. So I'm the author of 3 books of poems and a newer project that I'll talk about in a little bit that's a weird hybrid form. and I also help with some field work with marine mammals here locally. So I go back and forth between education, observation, writing, creativity. I teach at Brandeis University and try and straddle those worlds in effective ways. And as a writer and also as a naturalist, I'm really, really interested in how hilarious humans are when we try and engage in rhapsodic moments with the natural world and how we stumble over ourselves. I'm interested in how our human selves influence the ways that we experience the non-human world, and dramatizing the ridiculousness and the contradictions within those encounters. So that's my primary focus as a writer and artist. And as a naturalist, I can't call myself a biologist, but I play one on TV. I help out some in the field. I mostly focus on marine environments and marine mammals.
Cool.
I am Joerg Dressler. I'm originally from Germany, and I came to the United States about 20 years ago. And I spent my time split between Provincetown and Miami Beach, half-half. I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist with both feet in the art world. I do have a background as a graphic designer, which has an impact on my work as a landscape painter. And I'm mostly interested in the impact that nature has on the human psyche and how we relate to nature, and how important being in nature actually is for our mental well-being.
Mark Borrelli, I'm a coastal geologist. I work here at the center in Provincetown, the Center for Coastal Studies. Born and raised in Massachusetts, used to come to the Cape in the summers, got my undergraduate degree at Tufts University, went to the Outer Banks at UNC to get my master's degree, and then got my PhD at URI, and I did my PhD dissertation at Pleasant Bay on the Cape, so I have a lot of experience on the Cape. I'm also a research faculty, and I run a joint research lab with the University of Massachusetts in Boston. We have grad students, we have lab space, boats, so we do a lot of research, a lot of it field-based, so around the field, solving problems and doing that kind of work. And you know, I tell my students, if it's not fun, we're doing it wrong. You know, this is the good stuff, right? This is to be out there doing science and answering questions that need to be answered, and understanding how the world works a little bit is pretty cool stuff. And when Ian came to me and proposed the idea of coming here and being part of the panel and working with an artist for quite a few months, I was really intrigued. Didn't know what was going to happen, I don't think anybody did, but it's been really interesting, and I'm excited to talk about it.
And scary?
Yeah, scary, sure. Scary's part of it. Scary's good though, right?
Cool. Well, why don't we hear a little bit about your process with this collaboration and how you approached it, and then we can have the other panelists chime in with some of those prompts and questions.
Sure.
Sure. So when Ian and I started talking about this project, as I said earlier, I have no background in science, but I was interested in collaborating with a scientist.
Just throw in one thing.
Yeah.
You're a nature-based artist, and so where did that come from, and what's your knowledge base for as an artist in depicting nature? Just observation, or is it really
through observation? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like most artists, I became an artist when I was a child. You go out, you draw, you paint, you're interested, you want to see how that tree actually functions, how the branches are coming out, and you just study it. I mean, that's the research part of getting to where you are, and you do that your whole life. You do it constantly. There's Paula Scher, a very famous graphic designer. She once said, it took me 2 minutes to do this drawing, but it took me 30 years to learn how to do this in 2 minutes. And that's essentially, as an artist, what you do. You live it. And the reason why I'm mostly interested in nature probably goes back to a childhood drama where in the spring in Germany, the kind of like little streams get very high and have strong currents, and when I was 5, I fell into it and almost drowned. So the kind of like duality of nature and how beautiful it can be, but also how threatening it can be at the same time, is something that just stuck with me and that I'm interested in.
So that set you up for this collaboration?
Yes, yes. And then when we started the collaboration, Ian had proposed that we use a scientific method diagram as a starting point, and I had heard that another artist said, like, well, that's not how artists work, they don't have a method. And I kind of in my head immediately wanted to challenge that, because as an artist, if I don't make an observation, if I don't form a vision, I don't get to an end result.
Right.
So I was intrigued by taking that one specific, and I know there are various diagrams on how to lay out the scientific method, the one example that I had, and I just started out by seeing if I can have parallel boxes and see if, you know, I think there's a parallel between constructing a hypothesis and forming a vision and all the work that comes before and after. And that's what we started with in order to get to know each other and learn more about each other.
So those parallel boxes are sort of mirrored in some of the scientific the methods of forming hypotheses, or like artistic boxes?
They're artistic boxes, but it was really, for me, interesting to see, you know, the idea was Mark and I, we didn't know each other, you know, like total strangers. I have no background in science, not a lot of knowledge in art, so we just had to go get to know each other. So if there's this method, then it was interesting for me to see, can I relate to that? Do I have a similar process? Because if I don't understand what his process is and don't really fully know what my process is, that before may have been more subconscious and became more conscious in this work, then we can't really talk to each other. I mean, it's similar to when I came to the States. I mean, I spoke English, but did I really understand everything? Did I understood the words, but did I understand the meaning? It's very different. You have to be within kind of like a cultural environment to understand. A very good example, it's another project that I've been working on that actually had a little bit of impact on this project, is comparing German and English idioms. We, in an everyday environment, we talk in idioms, and when I first came in 1996, somebody at work said to me, "You're pulling my leg," and I was like, "I'm not touching you, what am I doing?" In German, we're saying, "You're taking me up on your arm." So if I say that to you, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So similarly, like, you know, Mark was telling me about his research, and I understood the words, but did I really understand the meaning? And did I understand what's important to him in his research? That's the question.
Let's go back to the idioms, because I think that's one of the ways you've described these very graphic art pieces that are on the wall back there. We'll go back and talk about that in a bit, but let's go to Mark now.
Oh, yeah, I mean, one of the first things I was, when I talked to Ian, when I talked to Joerg, is that it's a different language. Science is a language, right? And jargon always can get in the way. So we were really conscious of that, because how can I possibly tell him how to do science in the course of, you know, the time that we had? I can't just have him come out to the field with us and do science. That's as likely as me going into a studio and making art, right? It takes a lot longer than that. So scientists, something weird happens with scientists that might happen with artists. Your first language is your first language, and then you learn how to talk in science, and then you forget how to talk that first language sometimes. And scientists talk in a way like we're talking to other scientists, and we have to sort of retrain ourselves. No, you can't talk like that. You have to talk in that first language that everybody understands. And you spend a lot of time, a lot of classes, a lot of studying, learning how to talk in that second language. In the jargon, and you really have to learn it. And there's a comfort zone there. When I go to a conference, I can talk to people who I don't know, and immediately we know each other, right? Because we have that common language. We can start talking about things, and it's really important. That's the thing Joerg and I were trying to figure out how to do. And that's why we started with those, you know, scientific method and the artistic method, and trying to figure out how to do that, because it can be a barrier. to communication, and that's what we wanted to do. So we figured before starting to sort of do science together or do art together, let's figure out a common language, and that's really tricky, right? It's difficult because you have to learn another language.
So, did I understand you guys started out looking at Ballston Beach, maybe, or that you looked at several places? But I'd love to get some nitty-gritty details that put you guys in place in a real study situation.
Well, once we started thinking about this, I have a bad habit of thinking about next steps before I get finished with the step I'm on now. But one of the things we talked about, well, let's go through a project together. Let's go through a science project. Let's go through an art project and start walking each other through how we would use the methods that we're working on to, affect some kind of communication. I just, he happened to ask me, what am I working on right now? And I just looked at a report on Ballston Beach and Truro, some of the storms that were happening there. I have a student who's working on some research there, so we just started talking about it.
Can you just dramatize the Ballston Beach
Yeah.
events very briefly?
Right. So there's a low spot in Ballston where during a storm event, salt water will wash over into the upper Pamment River. It's a really low area between two dunes, and it can wash over, and it causes huge problems. It gets into people's water. It can get into people's water wells. There's a huge amount of erosion on the dunes, and there's sand being deposited in parking lots. So it's a big problem for the town. It's a natural process, right? And for the longest time, the town tried to stop this natural process, and trying to stop the ocean sounds about as dumb as trying to stop the ocean, right? It just doesn't work. So I talked to Joerg about it, and we just started, starting to do that. But then we realized we didn't have that common knowledge, so we didn't take that next step of using the common knowledge that we're trying to develop.
However, Stephanie, do you have anything to weigh in on this dilemma?
Yeah, I guess I have some questions about maybe starting with that and wondering if you also unpacked what both of your values were. Like, what do you value in a collaboration? What are your end goals? What does a product look like? And start to also kind of maybe like work backwards from what your outcomes are, because the jargon portion is a portion we all struggle with in collaborations. But so is kind of figuring out what you want the result to look like and where you want to go and how you would communicate that. So I'm interested in that kind of unpacking your communication styles piece together.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking as you were talking about the goal of science is to create a simple, elegant portrait of one question, and the goal of art is often to present a complicated, chaotic understanding of intersections. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, I would agree. I just wanted to say, to clarify a little bit about our collaboration. Initially, we really had planned to do field work together, but then because of conflicting schedules, which is often a big kind of like reality part of a collaboration, we couldn't do that, and I was going for 6 months to be in Miami Beach. So our collaboration actually ended up to be entirely virtual. We had regular phone calls, and we exchanged ideas in these phone calls while we were writing from our own personal views about the respective methods. So Mark wrote how he sees the scientific method working for him, the advantages, disadvantages, and I kind of wrote about my process in alignment with that method. So that was kind of like the low-hanging fruit that we wanted to pursue and that we knew we could pursue within the limited time. Because a real collaboration, and I think especially when you're coming from different fields, is probably better suited when it has an open end and when it doesn't have a deadline where you have to actually present a product. And I think we both, and maybe even Ian, we were struggling at the beginning a little bit with the idea that, can we really do this? Can we be okay with not having an outcome at all? And that's the outcome. It was, at least for me, a little bit, being someone who likes to fulfill a task and come up with a tangible thing.
It's kind of like Edgar was saying, that you just do something. You plant that tree,
yeah,
even if the world's going to end. But I'm interested in this kind of dual parallel document that you put together, and can you just give like a couple brief examples of where those process steps aligned and where they might have been unaligned, or interestingly in contrast?
I think one of the things that for me was interesting is that, we're still wrestling with this. We're still trying to figure this out. I know when I haven't done science, right? I mean, I can develop a hypothesis, but if I've screwed something up, then I haven't done science. I've made a mistake, and I have to go develop my hypothesis because I couldn't publish it or it doesn't work because I've made a mistake, and that happens. It happens all the time.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
I guess. You still did science though, right? Like you just got a negative result. Right. So like that's a different.
I guess if I poorly designed something, right? So if I design an experiment that was poorly designed, then I'm not doing science. Well, you could say I'm doing bad science, but I made a mistake, and I have to go back and do it again because I've learned personally from it. But until it goes out to the larger community, there is no journal for the inconsequential results. Right? Unfortunately,
one of the biggest scientific fails is to reason based on anecdote.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big problem too. But in terms of the compatibility or the places where they overlap, one of the things was, so when I would develop a hypothesis, we do something, then we realize, oops, we forgot to think about that variable. This is no longer valid. We have to go back and do this again. And I think, so part of it is, develop hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and then examine the results. And then Joerg came up with, similar things where, if you're creating something, you're doing something, and then if you don't like it, you're going to revise and review and change it. And I think in that respect we do it internally, and then we are the first reviewer. We are the first entity that says yes or no, go forward or start all over again. And there was some we don't put it out to the public and say, hey, what do you think of this? Until we're comfortable with it, until we're satisfied with it, until we've done everything in our method that we said we were going to do. So that was really important, and I think that was a parallel that we found.
Well, and I think the starting point, the biggest parallel is that an artist and a scientist, they do this because they're curious about something. They have questions. They make observations and have questions, and that curiosity is essentially what fuels the process and going through that and wanting to find the answers.
That's a real human filter for everything that kind of takes it out of the measurement realm. But it seems like an opportunity for Liz to weigh in on that as a poet looking at nature, what does that bring to a scientist?
Well, I think most of the scientists I know are also a practicing artist in some way, shape, or form, right? It's not a crazy divide that we're talking about. And if we go back in time, of course, the idea of the Victorian generalist, right? I think of myself as an aspiring generalist. I think bringing these things into conversation is so important. But I think that I was thinking a lot about credibility as a scientist and credibility as an artist and how you earn that. And I've been thinking about, as a scientist, you earn credibility through dispassionate reason, right? If your results are tinged by emotion or by bias, which of course they all are, by the way, then you lose credibility. As an artist, if you present something that's dispassionate, it's usually not going to be emotionally credible. It's not going to be engaging in that way. So I think we earn our authority through really different means, and I think that's what's interesting to me. And I've just turned in a manuscript for a book that'll be published next year, and it's about working as a guide in Antarctica. And so being the voice of science and ecology to these tourists who are going down there, being curious as a naturalist about the wildlife I encounter and how that matches up and doesn't match up with what I've read and studied and understood ecologically, and then also my own emotional response and the layers and the frustrations and the gritty routine of being a cog in the tourist machine and how that's complicated and interesting. I wanted to bring all of those into conversation and to contradict myself, to use more technical language to explore some of those different emotional layers. So I use a lot of footnotes that give background to the presumptions that are foregrounded in the prose. I use prose and short poems. I'm using images, and I really just want to present work in argument with itself. And how did I get there from where I began? I'm not really sure, but I'm interested in the argument being the palpable drama on the page, in contradiction being the nexus of what's experienced once the thing is produced. And I'm interested in how both science and poetry contribute to understanding place in this work. So, how do I understand a crab-eater seal? I understand it through science, but how do I understand Antarctica? I understand it through Coleridge. And all of those things are coming together, well, through the Albatross and Rime of the Ancient Mariner and,
Right, Coleridge, yeah,
Yeah.
right, of course, yeah. That idea of the argument with yourself, did that enter into the collaboration experience for you guys? Was there conflict or of ideas? Oh no, you guys were just totally on board with each other.
Well, it was distant, right? We weren't distant. We were firm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we were fine. I think we were, because we were both looking for the same thing. Right? When we talked about what the goal was, we were both trying to do the same thing. We weren't trying to sort of see it from a science perspective or an artist perspective. We were trying to put the two together and see where the matches were, what things matched up and what things didn't. So we didn't really have any conflict, not yet.
Did you have any aha moments though? Like, let's say like one of you was talking, and this is one of our favorite prompts to ask, or like one of our favorite things to measure when we watch people have a dialogue in these workshops is the building and the cross negotiation and the like, oh, you said this made me think of this. Let's take it here. Like how many types of moments like that happen for the two of you?
Yeah, I mean, when Joerg first showed me the mock-ups of these 4 images that he put together, he asked me, he said, just be ruthless. Tell me what you think. Does it make sense? And quite honestly, 90% of it I said, yeah, this is solid. There were 1 or 2 things I said, I wouldn't do this and I wouldn't do that, and because one thing doesn't really lead to another, it's causality, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I was comfortable. We set up, and we probably said this so often it was almost starting to get annoying. Please be honest. Just tell me what you think. I'm not worried. Just say whatever you want to say. And as a scientist, that really should be understood, right? I mean, we know that it's about ideas and it's not about us. It doesn't always happen that way, but just a short story. Right after I started this, I spoke with Ian. I met with Joerg once. I went to a conference and we had dinner with a bunch of colleagues, and we were around a circular table. And I told them about this project. Oh my goodness! The reactions I got were stunning. I mean, I had people in there. I had a professor in his 70s. I had some colleagues who were 30s and 40s. I mean, that whole age group, gender group, and it was amazing the wide range of responses. And it was, how dare they? They don't know what they're talking about. It's 2 different worlds. They can't pretend to be scientists. And then it was also, that's phenomenal. We need so much help in figuring this stuff out. It was just a wide range of responses, and I was stunned. I thought it was very passionate.
If you can get people to say "How dare they," then you are really succeeding.
Yeah, it was this. Yeah, there was. I was surprised, but there was a lot of that.
But so I have a question for both of you now. So here are these beautiful prints on the wall. When you think about attribution, is that your art, or is Mark Borrelli a collaborator? And Mark, when you publish your results, is you're going to be a co-author on a paper, or how does that work?
I can't answer the second part of the question, but I can answer the first one. It's a collaboration, definitely from my point of view, because
Who gets the money when you sell it?
actually, if those 4 sell, and they are for sale, it's supporting next year's Broto. Not entirely.
And tax deductible.
That was not an intended pitch. But,
I didn't know that actually, so that was not a
well,
seated
that was
question.
just internal conversation we had. It's not even an official one. But anyhow, when we had our conversations and we talked, and I was mentioning my other idioms project, then Mark immediately said, like, oh, idioms, scientific idioms. And the more we talked about it, I personally realized that there aren't any idioms in terms of climate change. They don't exist yet. Yet idioms we use so often in order to educate young kids and communicate a very complex idea. And I thought, well, maybe there's something we can do. And for me, in this whole project, there was always this background of mine as a designer where I try to engage people to get them interested in a topic. So how can I make climate change more accessible, the topic, without it being, we talk about organizations being eco-friendly, but people are responsible. And responsible that's work. And it's in direct contrast to our consumer mentality. So anything that has to do with climate change, we have to actually use our brain, and we can't just consume. So it was the idea of, can you bring these kind of like very heavy topics into a more kind of like consumer or accessible kind of way? And then the idioms came up again. So because of the conversations, the idea of using everyday idioms and putting them in context with specific problems in regards to climate change was compelling to me, and it would have never ever happened if we hadn't had the conversations we had.
I wonder if Stephanie could weigh in on this, because I'm sure that this idea of idioms or whatever, there's a bunch of ways to describe these shorthand ways of communicating, and sometimes they can be an obstacle to understanding or a way to gloss over any depth.
Yeah, and I think it might even be beyond that. I think it might be this question of community building, which is part of what idioms do, right? Like if you know the idiom, you're part of the community. And there are, I would say, 2 different levels of community that we're talking about up here. And one is something that we try and support at this Center for Interdisciplinarity, which is like just academics, right? Like what do you do if you want to do one of these interdisciplinary collaborations and your like colleagues think that you're nuts, right? When they're like, how dare you? Why do you do that? As a university, one of the things you can do is build spaces to support that. So we do things like host write-ins where you can come work on your work with people who like also do that, and we bring you food, and like it's a safe space to like do your crazy out there cool work. We host mixers actually in the community for community members and researchers.
What's the community that you're talking about?
So I'm talking like, if I say like mixers in the community, I'm talking about the greater like Lansing community. So we just did one for a thing called Food at MSU, where we invited community members who had any interest in like doing food-related research with MSU people doing food-related research to start a seed grant program where one of the things was you had to be involved in community. So I'm wondering about the process of community for these collaborations, right? Because we're talking a lot about how do you communicate it out there? How do you make it palatable for the general public? How do you express something in a way that someone's going to understand? So when do you involve the community in the collaborative process?
Yeah,
and
how do we bridge that divide?
Yeah.
There's a scientific community, and it's very important for dialogue and testing of ideas, and it's there's a built-in set of a culture as well. But a lot of people, my friend Paul Tasha on Tasha Hill, he says, why do we have to be artists? You're closing us out of this too. We make things and we live in the land and we understand as well as anybody what's so special about artists. So how do we bridge those 2 overlapping circles of art and science to what are those other communities that we need to accomplish anything at all?
Especially when we're talking about issues like climate change, which involve things like sustainability that we talked about, creative placemaking, arts in the community, food justice, food access, all of those things that are directly impacted by climate change that directly impact the individuals in your community. Yeah. How does the work you do as an artist or a scientist impact them? And when do you bring them in? When do you bring them into your process? How do you design a process that's equitable and allows for that in a collaboration? So those are all questions I like to try and pose at people, try and pose it myself even when I do that kind of work.
I'd like to bookmark that for anyone on the panel that wants to respond, but I also want to open it up here while we continue this.
So I want to respond to 2 things. I'm going to push back a little bit against your idea that scientists are dispassionate and objective about things.
Well, I mean, only in what they publish,
right?
Not
but
in their engagement.
I think that there's a unique parallel in that artists are compelled to be artists and scientists are compelled to be scientists. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I have to be a CPA. It's the only thing in the world I could possibly do. I realize people probably are like that. but I think artists and scientists are both incredibly passionate about their approach to thinking about the world. That's just a comment. The other thing is that I've been trying to embed in my laboratory this idea that we don't have lab meetings, we have workshops. That we are workshopping our ideas and the way we think about our results and what they mean and what do we do with them, very much the way you would workshop a play or a book or something like that. And my students are actually really responding well to this idea. We don't do anything different than we ever did in a lab group meeting. But just the whole change in the approach to what we're trying to do has been really interesting.
Does that ever involve, outsiders, artists, for example, or philosophers?
I would love it if it did. We haven't quite gotten there yet.
I just want to say a couple things. I think that's great. I think that's true. I think Joerg mentioned this earlier that he was an artist when he was a kid. I think all kids are artists and scientists. Right? Kids want to figure out stuff. They want to learn stuff. They like playing with bugs. They like doing this. And I think sometimes we get that taken out of us, for better, for worse, and it stops happening and that kind of thing. And I think we have to remember this really great comment about we shouldn't pigeonhole ourselves about art where scientists are artists, right? I mean, I think that was a really good comment made earlier. And Paul Tasha, who I know, doesn't really fit in any box. But I think it's a great point. I just wanted to make that comment.
Question back there.
I just wanted to mention there's a new field of art called socially engaged art today. And next weekend in New York, I was just reading about, it's going to be like, I don't know, their 50th year of this, I think. But it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One of the museums today are really struggling with how to keep their audiences, art museums. I don't know about science museums if they're struggling so much, but anyway. So, they always have performances, they have panels, they have conferences. Every time an art exhibition opens, even in a gallery level in New York. So engaging audiences and socially engaged art, just like science has citizen science, where you can have, because of social media, you can actually send out, citizens that want to go and take the tests of the water here and there because it's in their backyard, send it in for you, and they're helping, scientists that way. So this public engagement is really important, and I personally have envisioned a performative, not performance in the strict sense, but a performative project on resiliency that would help. I know when you work together on a project and you really go through the struggling of communication and building relationships, that person-to-person stuff, it's like a glue that will take you through many, many hurdles, but you also, at the end of it, you're really proud that you were a part of the whole. And I want to do a community engagement program here, a project here that's performance. If anybody has any interest in that, I'd love to talk to them.
Could I just ask you to identify yourself, just because I might have missed that before, but what's your background and where are you coming from?
No, my name is Cynthia Panucci, and 30 years ago I started an organization in New York City called Art and Science Collaborations. So it became, through the use of the internet, an international organization, and between 1998 and 2002, we did 4 seminal conferences in New York, first at the Cooper Union Art and Engineering School. Peter Cooper brought together, he was a railroad guy, brought together these things for that school. And then at the CUNY Graduate Center were 2 of the conferences. So in any case, I feel that this is very exciting as I'm stepping down and going back to my artist roots again. That this is sort of the second wave of art and science where people are born digital, they have the same tools, digital tools as scientists, which is overcoming lots of language barriers when you have the same visual tools or even ways to express yourself and access to social media. And anyway.
Great.
I just wanted to, I was thinking about socially engaged art as we were talking about this. I teach a course on publishing at Brandeis. I run an alternative press that's a little bit more project-based than a traditional literary press, and I'm really interested in socially engaged art. There's a great book for people who are interested and want to read a beautiful catalog of socially engaged art projects. I think Nato Thompson edited it. It's called Living as Form. It's gorgeous. I think it came out in 2012 or 11. And a lot of them are projects in New York from Creative Time. And I think what I admire about socially engaged art is that, and I think this ties very much into what everyone has been talking about in terms of collaborations between art and science, is that the end result isn't really the product, the performance, the whatever, isn't really the product. The product in socially engaged art is the documentation and the storytelling around the project. And I think that's very similar to what we're talking about in terms of collaborations with art and science. The engagement, the discussion about how people are affected, however you document that thing, that is as much the product as whatever happens at the end. And so I think there are really interesting parallels in that way. And then, there was something else, but I've forgotten.
Well, I want to expand on products, on this whole idea of products. And I know you guys were probably still are contemplating what products can come out of this, aside from a method and an experience. But Ian has sort of set up the question here in a very goal-oriented way that, how do we change thinking about climate change? How do we change the whole way of living and talking about it for a wider audience? But if that's, whether that's possible or not, what are the ways to make joint products, collaborative products, and what are some of those collaborative products? What could they be? As that's probably.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to use when I set up collaborations with people is like a collaboration, documentation agreement where you like think about all of this from the outset, right? Like you sit down and you just brainstorm, like, what could we do? What is the coolest thing I could do right now? Could I write a story with someone? Could I make an app? Would a 360 VR experience be the most effective thing? And you just go, sky's the limit, right? There are some really tangible things you can do. But when we want to measure and affect change in these large ways, sometimes just taking it out and going a little more creatively allows us to do that. But also setting the responsibilities and agreements from the outset helps too. So I don't know about anyone else. I like to know where the boundaries are with my collaborators. I like to know how they work. I like to know what the expectations should be. I like to know where the money's going from the outset, right? So I think kind of setting that framework up before you engage in the collaborations too allows you to be a little bit freer because you know what's expected of whom in the collaboration.
There's maybe just one follow-up here on is can you provide any examples with your through your work at MSU? And
yeah, so a lot of time we work with people on strategic planning. So we help people go from no mission vision goals to a mission vision goals that is deeply informed by their needs, their community's needs, and sometimes those communities are artists, scientists, philosophers, engineers, people working on sound, right? And they'll come up and they'll say here's what we need, or you can work with a group and say, we do a lot of process-based work, so where can the interventions in the process be? We've worked with groups to build, right, you were talking about jargon and discussions earlier, building a dictionary from the outset with your group so that you know what terms the group is using for the collaboration. Building pieces that you can start to interact with. And one of the things that we're gonna do this fall is, hopefully funding will come through, use some of these prompts to spur an ag-based hackathon. So really allowing it to go far afield by prompting what you can do when you bring in artists and a scientist and a programmer together.
An ag-based hackathon. Okay, so there's a product. Can you just give us the elevator pitch of what an ag-based hackathon is?
Yeah, there will be 4 or 5 prompts. We're going to bring in some outside sponsors, and the plan is to have undergrad student teams and graduate students from all backgrounds come to the room, hear the prompts, and then by the end of 36 hours create a solution to some of those prompts.
and we're looking at things like food justice, supply chain issues, how do you get community to know about programs when they don't have access to the internet, how do you build things for students on campus that help them engage with the actual real world. So like, how much food waste do you create? Can you build an AR or VR experience for when you're in the dining hall about that? So
Cool.
questions
All right,
like
let's
that.
go back to the question back here.
I had a-
Microphone?
Yeah, I'm a socially engaged artist. I'd be interested in speaking with you. And I wanted to appreciate, first of all, Stephanie, several beats back, you're bringing into the conversation community engagement, public engagement, and now I can't remember who said it, but I want to just add a plural to all of that. Communities, publics, and art worlds. There isn't just one art world. I'm not the kind of artist that makes products that, you know, like those. My work is, I use story circle method. I use conversations, dialogue. You know, it's collaboration is very much a part of my artistic process. And that's a very different kind of art world than, you know, the kind of art world that you're talking about. So I just want to, you know, kind of expand the way that we're thinking about art worlds and science worlds and publics. And,
Cool.
you know,
Yeah,
make them
thank you
plural.
for
That's
that.
actually reminding me that, you know, the idea of citizen science is such a powerful tool, but with the Trump administration's policies on immigration, it's a problematic term, right? So there's a reconceptualization now about community science, just making sure that it's inclusive and doesn't feel like, even by its terminology, it's excluding anyone who might want to participate.
So we have someone in the back here.
Okay. I'd like to bring the discussion back to what the focus of the conference is, which is climate change and how artists and scientists collaborate on climate change. So the question for all of you is, what areas do you think are most amenable or would be easiest or more important to collaborate on as an artist and scientist team? I'll just mention that I belong to a collection of artists. I'm also an architect and I have a science background. And we deal with an area of climate change that's more visual. You're able to interpret scientific information more visually, and that's the kind of path of water that goes from melting icebergs and, you know, ocean, rising seas. My work is on the conflict of architectural infrastructure and rising seas and coastal ecosystems. Having said that, I'd like to see what you all think is the most optimal collaboration between artists and scientists as it relates to climate change.
So as a scientist, that's a tricky one for me, because we have to be really careful being scientists and being advocates. It's a very, very fine line. Jim Hansen, who's a fantastic scientist, world-class scientist, head of NASA, the moment he comes out and says, climate change is happening, we have to do something about it, this is going to be the greatest catastrophe, the next generation, his science is of less use now. That's just the way it is, right? And we have these conversations all the time. That dinner table where we had that conversation, one of the conversations was, what do we do? We're very confident that it's happening. We're the experts. How do we convey to the public the enormity of the problem without taking ourselves out of the equation, no pun intended, right? So that's a really, really tricky thing, and maybe there's room there for the artists and the science community to come together, because we can't go too far. Once we go too far, we're not scientists anymore, we're advocates.
Actually, you and I have talked about this a lot because of some of the projects we've collaborated on scientifically. One really interesting example is a couple of years ago, you guys did a model of flooding in the center of Provincetown, of stormwater flooding, right? And it showed areas that would be flooded in a certain kind of storm. And everyone thought that was really great, and it went on the shelf, and it was quite interesting. And then this year it happened. And they pulled out that report, which is really only a couple years old, and they said, look, everything in this report are the places where that got wet, where the records were in the basement were destroyed, where the restaurants had to gut and rebuild. And so all you did was create a model. Now, but right along the same time of that, I took, for Earth Day, I took the 5th graders out from the school with chalk and a basketball, and we started drawing the flood lines on the street up to the steps of Town Hall with the 5th graders. We're just following the map and walking along, drawing chalk lines, and we're using the basketball to kind of, which way does this slope and where's water going to go? Let the basketball go and see where it goes. And so, you know, we did the same thing, sort of not in an advocacy way, but by doing it, we had people coming out of their shops and saying, "What are you doing on my steps?" And that, in a way, was the opening of the conversation for the meaning of the science. But anyway, so.
Can I just,
Yeah, please.
as also a scientist on this panel, or someone with science training, the scientists can't be advocates statement is a record scratch for me, especially for the younger generation of scientists. I don't think that's true. I think that's something you negotiate personally, whether or not as a scientist you're an advocate. It's one of the things we actually make people have conversations about in workshops. But if you look at these upcoming elections, there are a lot of young scientists running for office and acting as advocates, partially in response to the Trump administration. So I just want to say that that's a thing that's out there, right? And that's generational, and it's a personal divide. So I just want to flag that.
You know, that's actually a fundamental topic of discussion which we will not resolve today, but I think is super important for us all to understand and take a position on. But I credit both of these points of view. I think it's really important for the public to understand the culture of science and what scientists are allowed to do to maintain their credibility. But let's go to this question.
Can I answer her question though, about what type of art? So if I was, right, I don't understand everything about climate change, and I think one of the hardest things to understand might be uncertainty models. Right? And I think that's a really hard thing for the public to understand. I would love to see progress on like finding some way to use collaboration to unpack uncertainty models and Bayesian statistics and all of those things so that when the public hears things like that, they understand what a model is and where the limits are, because there are so many caveats on those that there's got to be some way that we can use different types of collaborations to unpack these really complicated situations.
Somebody write that down. That's an outcome right there. But so we have a couple questions out here. You've been waiting.
So my question is about how important is it that we share a theory of change around climate, right? Because I was just recently watching some documentaries, and the person's making a scientific case for planet movement, the magnetic field or whatever from Jupiter and Mars, different things, the sun, all kinds of things, saying basically that if you look back, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, that we have these spikes and peaks and that they correspond with the changes in our climate on the planet, and it's happened before. So that's out there, and it's out there from credible people. But I think to myself, well, okay, does it matter why as much as it matters what we do and how we respond to the fact that it's happening and the effects of it? So just want to know from you, how important is it that we share a theory of climate change?
I want to throw one comment on that, and I'll try not to dominate, but it's as not just scientists, but planners. I work for the National Park Service. We have responsibility for maintaining the national park for the next generation. We don't have a responsibility to maintain the national park for 1,000 years from now. We just need to hand it off to people that have the same mission as us. And so here's where we put these long-term climate fluctuations in context. What are we going to do now to hand off the world to the next couple generations so that they have some agency in both living sustainably with natural processes and having the same enjoyment and opportunities that we have? So, and do you guys want to respond to that at all?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, that's what we're here for, right? It's going to dominate the next few generations on Earth, to understanding climate change and the impacts. So I think it's hugely important that we do that. What you're talking about, so there can be misinformation, there can be disinformation, right? I mean, climate change is getting to the point now where if you don't believe it, you don't believe it for science reasons, right? It's like evolution. If you don't believe in evolution, you're not believing it for a different reason than science, because the science is clear, right? So that's a hard conversation to have with somebody. If they're just saying, well, yeah, there's natural variability. Yeah, there's always been natural variability, but what we're seeing here is clearly outside the realm of natural variability. This has never happened before in this short a time. Sea level has been much, much higher than it is right now, right? But it's never happened, as far as we know, this fast in this short a time. And again, pumping this much CO2 in the atmosphere, it's hard to give another reason why this is happening. So when people don't believe this kind of thing, then it's a different topic. But as far as I'm concerned, I have a daughter. There's nothing more important than understanding the impacts of climate change and what they're gonna, and what we can do about it.
Cool. So
I
I
just wanted to add something to that. I think even if you believe in climate change, it's such an abstract subject matter that I think it's also a question of how do you personalize it, so that, I mean, I'm aware of so many things that I could change in my own personal behavior, but what does it take me to actually do it? And I think that's something that I'm worried about and wondering about. How do we personalize it? Because nowadays everything is so personalized, and if something is abstract, how do you get that to that level that it is my problem?
I want to get the audience, because we might run out of time. So who's next?
I think Aaron.
Aaron?
The threads go so quickly, it's hard to know which one to respond to. But I guess I wanted to come back to the advocacy thing, because your statement just now about this being the most important thing for your daughter. But that aside, my comment was going to be an architect who says this building is really important and you shouldn't tear it down because architecturally this is within the scope of the history of architecture, does not lose any credibility as an architect when she says that. None. So why does a scientist lose credibility when he or she says this organism, this system that I study and I understand and I know how it works, and if we lose it, that this is a loss, just like losing this architectural feature is a loss. I don't lose any credibility for that. And it's not new generational. I mean, I'm so senior in the field, I don't lose any credibility when I say that.
So, do you have a problem with a scientist who gets funding from a particular industry and their results support that industry's findings? There's a long silence there. Yeah, of course.
That's because I'm thinking about the response.
Okay.
Because and we can argue about the merit of the scientific method, but if there really is a fixed scientific method where you've got a question that leads to a hypothesis, that leads to a test, that leads to a result, that leads to a statistical outcome, if you actually followed that and did what you describe as good science, it shouldn't make any difference who paid for it.
Absolutely. But it's that appearance of a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest. And a lot of people don't have a problem with that, and you're one of them. But a lot of people do. A lot of people do.
We have a bunch of questions, so let's line them up in order so we try to get to everybody. I think
Good for you,
waiting back here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a psychologist, and I guess I'm ping-ponging back and forth here because I'm back at this question of not believing in climate change, and I agree with you that if it's not about the science, I think what's really important is it's about people. Education is only one little piece, and we know this. There's a very, very weak correlation between what people know and what they believe and how they act and so forth. And so just because you get all the data doesn't mean you take it in. And what's so powerful is the social networks that we're part of, and how when those social networks are threatened, it can be really very difficult to think differently than those who are in your networks, whether it's family, peers, or so one of the beautiful things I think about bringing at the sort of metaphorical level of the scientist artists together is they bring your different dialects together and your different social groups and your different social norms. There's a little modeling going on, but there's also this mini sort of parallel process of you're learning how to work as people in these different worlds, and I think that has to be spread. There was this comment about multiple communities, And that I think that's a really important piece, that multiple communities are working together, because then people from this community over here can relate to that particular kind of artwork and maybe work on this, this content. And this person over here might be helped because they relate to this person over here, and then it spreads. So I see hope.
Yeah, so let's see, who else? Do you have someone else back here? We have
Hillary.
a question here.
Thank you. I feel compelled to sort of jump into this advocacy question.
I knew climate change was going to cause this.
So my research is almost exclusively funded with federal public funds. And I think that scientists have, for most of the era of the climate change discussion, have kicked the can down the road about interpretation. My money comes from the taxpayers. If I don't place my research in context and then provide what I consider an informed perspective on what one can do with this information, then I don't think I'm doing my job. I think that actually, and I'm a mid-career scientist, I think advocacy is absolutely a mandate of my public funding.
It depends on the terminology. I mean, this might be semantics, right?
Okay.
I mean, advocacy might be semantics.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to use our expertise to tell people what we think. Advocacy to me is something different. Advocacy is different. So it might just be semantics. I think we're probably talking about the same kind of things. But just for instance, for the town of, when we did that map for the town of Provincetown, we said, you really need to take care of this. If you have a storm of record flood here, this is going to flood, and then town hall is going to flood, and you need to do something. We did not say that, but we didn't say you need to take these tax dollars and put them here, and you need to take money out of the schools and put them, that's not something we're going to do. We're just going to say this is really important, and then once the water reaches this level, you're going to get flooding, and you might not have known this before.
And Mark,
Yeah.
can you just set the stage? Because I don't think everybody knows that January 4th we did have this flood up to Bradfield Street, and Commercial Street was a river.
So we did a study, it was commissioned by the state, it's a coastal resiliency study. We did a map, and we mapped the pathways, storm tide pathways of where the extent and the pathways water would take during a number of flood events. And it was done in June of 2016, and in January of 2018, we had the storm of record. And what's interesting is that when we talk about sort of personalizing this kind of thing, the storm of record was 6 inches higher in Provincetown than the previous storm of record. The previous storm of record was in the blizzard of '78, which was about 40 years ago. Sea level rise over the last 40, 50 years, it's been about 6 inches. So that flood of record was higher by the same amount that sea level rose. So we talked about that a lot, and we said these things, but it just happened here. And then in March, we got a couple more big storms. So yeah, no, it's an interesting time.
I want to just say one thing about this. I want to chime in my own on this advocacy question. How many people in the room have been to a town meeting? And so sometimes things happen in town meetings that may not be the wisest choice in our opinion, but they are part of this process that is just as much a value as anything, right? And we live with that. In the town meeting, like we might present the study, and then there might be some alternatives on the table about adding berms, like flood control or whatever, and then there's going to be another proposal about a new fire truck or a school need, and that's where the voters get to express their values, and the values are expressed in a completely different forum than the information and the science. And I think that's where the separation needs to be really strong. And of course the scientists can vote.
And we do.
And we do. I don't know how much time we have left, but I want to give the panelists a moment to give maybe a closing comment or something, or open question to pass it along.
I've been sitting here thinking about that question about what is the most important project for artists and scientists to collaborate on in regards to climate change. And as a writer and even as a naturalist, my personal work is based on observation and storytelling, whether it's about an animal or an emotional interior. And I think connecting, I've been thinking about intersectionality of communities, of ways of being, of cultures, and I think connecting readers, viewers' hearts to stories of climate change, really firmly based in science, is the most important work that we can do. As a writer, when I'm teaching my students, I try and make sure I impress upon them the importance of getting the facts right. We have to fact check our art. We have to fact check our stories. We have to make sure that when we're playing and imagining, we're doing that with knowledge of what we're departing from. I'm not saying everything has to be non-imagined and non-fantastical, but we have to thoroughly understand the facts that we're playing with, and we have to, I just think that the more as artists and writers that we can dramatize the emotional impacts and make people connect and hopefully feel compelled by the facts of science and climate change, that's where the important work for me really lies.
Can I respond to that just a little bit? Because a backstory for this whole project is a very important meeting I had with Liz about this a few months ago, about the importance of documenting the experience of going through this process, and even diarizing or observational work or noting down an impression of what's going on is part of the work product that we're thinking about doing through this model. So I just wanted to say that's one of the reasons why Liz is on the panel, because she's so passionate about making sure that we understand a record of what's going on here. So that's really with it.
Thanks. So anyone else in the panel? Closing comment?
Yeah, I want to kind of reflect on what a rich dialogue happened when we decided to unpack advocacy in the room, right? Like, and these are the kind of things I think are really important in collaborations, and they're important to have your community members in there, right? So that everyone understands everyone's perspective, views, and values, so that when you go out to build these kind of collaborations, you know what the playing field looks like. So I think it was really interesting to bring up the point of communities, because you're right. Like, as someone who like blacksmiths in Lansing, like, no, I'm not gonna like. Right? Everyone just thinks my stuff's weird, and I'm okay with that. But right, it's like I belong to a different community than someone who like is a formal artist, and I belong to different communities as a person. When I have my like MSU hat on, when I have my like I'm gonna work in the forge hat on, when I have my center hat on, and so right, like when I speak about advocacy, I'm speaking from my own perspective, and so it's important to understand our positions and our communities when we're looking at these types of collaborations. So.
You guys want to say anything else? No?
I'll just say my closing comment, which is I think the most important product that has the most impact on people's mindset is direct experience, which means for me, being out in the water and seeing how waves break on the shoreline, jumping into the pond and seeing the vegetation on the bottom and feeling it viscerally, or actually some of the science has a very close proximity to this experience, where Mark has been doing seafloor mapping with these interferometric sonar and stuff, and the images are better than Hollywood. They are so compelling. So anyway, that's my pitch for what science and art can do together, is to create immersive experiences where people can't help but feel how the world works and be good animals in the world. That's my